Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Dravidian Does History, the audio podcast with me, Arjun. I know I've been away for a few weeks because life happened, and when life happens, you have to listen to life. And the universe has given me a few little curveballs in the last few weeks, so that's why I've been away and I've been able to do any more episodes since the last session that we did. In short, what happened was one of my associates who works for me had a baby, and I have been covering for him for overnights. While it is an excellent opportunity for me to read books, continue writing my next book, which will be volume two of The Lords of India, and catch up on all the research that I need to do for the same. It means that I have been sleeping throughout the day and not been able to do research and the prep work for the podcast and record anything. Ergo, why there haven't been a new episode in the last 4 weeks. But today I felt in the mood and I felt prepared enough to talk about a very important topic that I think is very interesting and very pertinent to today's times. So I thought we'd launch it to it today. This episode is a standalone episode, which means that it is not connected to the History of India series for the Lords of India Volume 1 that I do for the main podcast. This is a standalone episode in which I talk about a very interesting and very particular topic that I think is very interesting and doesn't get enough airplay and attention in most other spaces. The topic for today's podcast is the presentation of masculinity and gender in an imperial setting by rulers of a feminine nature. I know the title is a little long, but in the short of it is that there haven't been too many female regnant monarchs in world history. There have been thousands and thousands upon kings on the different dynasties across the different kingdoms and states in the world in the last 5,000 years of monarchic history. But even in the most lenient and most egalitarian of societies, where there are tons of goddesses that people worship, where women have certain amounts of power, be it legal or political, often the top position has still often been reserved only for the men. If we look at China, if we look at India, if we look at England, if we look at Europe, if we look at the Middle East, if we look at Egypt, if we look at Mesoamerica, if we look at Mesopotamia, all of these significant civilizations which have had really long histories of powerful monarchs with different dynasties coming and going at different stages, very rarely do we see females in the top position as independent rulers. If we look at the example of England, for example, which is one of the longest lasting single family dynasties in the world, right from the time of Alfred of Essex, right down to the modern day, they have had a better record of female monarchs in positions of power. But even then, up until the pre modern times, they've only had two regnant queens, that being Queen Mary I and Queen Elizabeth I, one after the other, in the 16th century in the Tudor dynasty. And only after that, towards the 18th century, with the arrival of the Stuarts and their succeeding dynasties, do we get more female monarchs represented, with Queen Anne and then Queen Elizabeth II and Queen Victoria and all of these people. But even then, they are in the minority in a long list of monarchs. They are the exception that proves the rule in that case. If we look at India, or India as big as it is, as diverse as it is, there have been very few female monarchs of dominant states in India as well. Why? I think it has something to do with the cultures generally tending to prefer military personnel to lead their states. And in most cases, most societies don't think women are capable of leading military states. And that may be one of the reasons why we've rarely had female monarchs in positions of power, especially as independent sole rulers. We have had lots of powerful queens of powerful kings, as in the case of the Byzantines or Spain and spaces like that. But very rarely do we have independent female monarchs who derive power and authority in their own space, holding power in their own right, not derived from somebody else, be it a husband or a son or a father, and then or acting as regents to any of those people. A great example in case of India would be the Empress Noor Jahan in the 16th century. I do mean said the 17th century, who was the empress of Emperor Jahangir, who ruled along with him and wielded extraordinary power, but only because he was incapacitated because of his extreme drinking and physical ailments, and only for a very short period of time. We also have the example of Begum Jahanara, who was the daughter of Shah Jahan, the emperor, as well as the sister of the successor of Shah Jahan, Alamgir I, who ruled along with him as the leader of the family, but was never regnant, but had extraordinary, inordinate amounts of power nonetheless. These are some of the examples of women who were in extraordinary positions of power, who wielded a lot of authority, but again, it was connected to a ruling monarch or a reigning monarch, and their power derived from their association with that person. Today, I wanted to talk about two regnant monarchs who were female, who ruled in their own capacity as independent rulers, but had certain familiar themes running throughout their reigns that connect them over about 3,000 years. I'm talking about, of course, the first fully independent female regnant pharaoh of Egypt, which is Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty, and the first and only empress of India, independent of any males, that is the Sultan Raziyya of the Delhi Sultanate of the 13th century. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I, who was one of the most significant pharaohs of the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt. And she came to power because of her association, not with her father, but because her mother was a descendant of the previous dynasty and her legitimacy flowed through her. She ruled as an independent pharaoh during the childhood of her successor Thutmose III after the death of her husband Thutmose II. So in that period, she wielded inordinate authority over the entirety of Egypt, and she ruled not as a queen regent, although she did do it for a few years. She ruled in her own power as an independent pharaoh, as depicted in her mortuary temple complexes at Deir el-Bahri and all the accoutrements of kingship as pertinent to the Egyptian culture. Similarly, Sultan Razia ruled independently as the empress or sultan of the Delhi Sultanate of northern India during its earliest phase of the Shamsi dynasty or the slave period from 1206 to 1296. She ruled from 1236 to 1240 as an independent monarch after the death of her father, ousting her stepbrother and taking over the throne. She was an unmarried Muslim woman who was not connected to anybody else in the family to be able to rule that throne. What is the connection between these two powerful female monarchs, you may ask? But the topic at hand is how they presented themselves to their court and their people and to history through their performance of gender. Both of these women were extraordinary because they had to find their position and their identity in a system where there had never been a female monarch of equal stature. So they had to present themselves in unique ways to identify themselves with the legitimacy and power of a male position while also holding on to the fact that they were also female. They couldn't negate their femininity and they could not also perform as males, but then they had to find a reconciliation between these two identities and find and forge a new path to present themselves to the audience, to the people, to the legitimizers, and to the court of other monarchs who were contemporaneous with them as well. And the ways in which Hatshepsut and Sultan Razia used the different tools at hand to present themselves in this amalgamation of male and female gender is a very interesting dichotomy that I think we should discuss and that we should try to understand to not only understand their mindsets about ruling, but also understand the cultures and societies and the periods in which they operated, and how across a few thousand years, similar kind of ideas and similar kind of tactics may have had to be used to present themselves in this position of unique power. We'll talk about Hatshepsut first. As I mentioned previously, Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I, and she was married to her stepbrother Thutmose II, and then she was succeeded by her step nephew of sorts, Thutmose III. So all of these men were members of a different dynasty who had taken over the throne of Egypt from the previous 17th dynasty. And the legitimization of these kings, apart from the fact that they had taken over the throne, was the fact that they were connected by marriage to the women from the previous dynasty. That's how they drew their legitimacy and confirmed it in the eyes of not just the priesthood, not just the courtly circles, but also of the people. That legitimacy derived through the female line was supplemented with, of course, military and male power. Thutmose I was married to a princess from the previous dynasty. That's how he confirmed his power. And therefore, when Thutmose II was to attain the throne, the only way he could confirm his legitimacy was by getting married to a princess who was born through that union of the previous pharaoh, as well as the daughter of the pharaoh from a previous dynasty, and who was also a full regnant queen companion of the previous pharaoh. So that's how Hatshepsut was a full royal princess, doubly having royal lineage. And so Thutmose II had to marry her to confirm his legitimacy. They ruled together for a few years. We don't get much information about Thutmose II and his reign because it is apparent that he was not extraordinarily powerful or influential. And eventually, probably because of ill health, he dies, and Hatshepsut takes the reins as the regent to Thutmose II's son through another concubine who reigned as Thutmose III. But again, because Thutmose II's father and mother, both of them were neither from royal bloodline proper, Thutmose III needed Hatshepsut's royal bloodline and legitimacy to confirm his legitimacy as the new pharaoh of Egypt. Therefore, Hatshepsut was his regent and confirmed her position as the most dominant political and familial figure in the dynasty at that period. So during the minority of Thutmose III, she operated as his regent, and then by the time he reached adulthood or young adulthood, he was sent off to train with the army and lead campaigns, while Hatshepsut ruled as the pharaoh, the independent sole pharaoh of Egypt. And this was extraordinary because there have been possibilities of other female pharaohs happening in Egypt's history, particularly figures like Sobekneferu in the Middle Kingdom, way back in the 12th dynasty. But again, we don't get any indication that she ruled by her own might and her own power and wielded nearly as much authority as Hatshepsut did. But Hatshepsut, because she had the bloodline connection and she had the wits and she had the intelligence and the authority and the support of not only the priesthood but also of the people, she was able to rule as an independent pharaoh, while her successor, the next pharaoh in training, Thutmose III, was out campaigning with the army and building relations there. So it was a bifurcated royal family where one section, the manly section, went off to fight wars and learn that craft. Hatshepsut was free to rule the kingdom and operate as an independent pharaoh. And did she ever? She created her own magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri called Djeser Djeseru, which is one of the most unique and fantastic mortuary temples in all of Egypt. And she derived her authority and presented herself to the people in various statues, in various cartouches, in the great obelisks that she erected in a very unique way. She never negated the fact that she was a woman, but presented herself to the people in traditionally masculine representations of a pharaoh. What that means is that when she was presented on her obelisks and her many carvings. She was shown in the traditional male garb with the crowns of Egypt, as well as the false beard that all Egyptian pharaohs always used, while using the feminine terms to talk about herself. She never called herself as a man. She always presented herself in the manly garbs that all previous pharaohs used, but never lied about the fact that she was a woman. So this was a contradiction in Egyptian kingly representations because they'd never had a female pharaoh before. But by using the traditionally masculine representations, but also using the female vocabulary, she was trying to reconcile the fact that this was unusual, but not entirely impossible. She also further tried to legitimize her rule and her position by calling herself the daughter of the god Amun. She was divinely born. She was not born just through the previous pharaoh, but she was born through the auspices of the god. The god came down and impregnated her mother. And thus, that is why she is the pharaoh. That is why she is the representative of the god in the world, because she was also divinely conceived, which is very reminiscent of a certain king of kings from the mythological book, the Bible. I guess that's where they got the story. So Hatshepsut thus presented herself through using both her feminine as well as masculine aspects that were necessary to present herself to the people of the world, to align herself with the traditional ways of presenting royalty and monarchy in the Egyptian setting. Similarly, when we look at Sultan Raziyya, the way that she presented her reign and her authority and her legitimacy draws direct comparisons to the way that Hatshepsut had to present herself in her period of time. Sultan Razia was the daughter of Sultan Iltutmish, who had established the Sultanate of Hindustan or Delhi as the preeminent power in the Indian subcontinent during the 13th century. He had inherited a throne which was one among several Islamicate and Persianate sultanates in India at the time, and from about 1220 to 1230s, Iltutmish went on several campaigns to consolidate his power and establish dominance over all the states that had existed during the time of his initial crowning, and then dominated them, captured his rivals, defeated them, and established Delhi as the center of the dominant Islamic state in all of the east of Asia. And he was even confirmed by the caliph in that position, especially since the attacks of Genghis Khan had destroyed all of the other prominent Islamic states in the Eastern world at the time. And then after the death of Iltutmish, the problem became who was going to succeed him. One of Razia Sultan's stepbrothers was initially placed on the throne by the nobles because, of course, he had a cock. That was the only valid reason that he would have been placed on the throne, even though it is mentioned by several sources that Iltutmish himself preferred Sultan Razia on the throne because he considered her to be more able and more capable and the best suited of all his children after the death of his main selected possible successor, Nasiruddin Muhammad, who had died a few years earlier. So what did Razia Sultan do? She incited the people of Delhi by telling them about the misrule of her stepbrother and his mother, Turkan and Shah Turkan and her son, who was the emperor, and incited the people into a rebellion. And then they went into the court and captured the temporary sultan and brought him to Razia Sultan, who had him executed. And she placed herself on the throne, now with the support of not just the people, but also a large section of the nobility as well. Once she had secured her place on the throne, there was some opposition from other provincial nobles who thought they would still have preferred a man on the throne, because of course they would. But again, being a woman of incredible capability in her 30s, unmarried still, but engaging and powerful and having learned power at the knees of her father, she went out in force and defeated her rivals and consolidated her power. In the record of the period from the various historical sources, it is said that Sultan Razia was a capable ruler who was not only militarily successful, but also was able to hold on to the different provinces of the Delhi Sultanate and was able to quell rebellions and turn those who were against her initially onto her side by being a capable and powerful ruler, which is what every state needed at the time. Somebody who was capable, somebody who was powerful, somebody who was active, somebody who dominated their subjects as well as their nobility, who projected that kind of power and legitimacy. And Sultan Razia certainly did. And her name itself, I think, highlights the fact that she did not consider herself to be an exception to the rule of the Sultanate. She was never called Razia Sultan, as she has been mistakenly called since in popular discourse. Razia Sultan would mean that she was, or Razia Sultana would mean that she was called Princess Razia. But in her coins and her inscriptions, she's always referred to as Sultan Razia, which means Emperor Razia, not Empress or the Lady Emperor or anything like that. She was never called the Lady. She was called as the Emperor Razia. She used that masculine or gender neutral term Sultan to signify her rule because she did not want to separate herself from the long lineage of monarchs who had established their identity as sultans by this point of time. Similarly, her coins drew direct reference to her legitimacy as the daughter of Sultan Iltutmish, because in several of her coins, once again, they refer back to her birth as the daughter of Sultan Iltutmish by referring to her as the Sultan Razia, daughter of the Sultan Iltutmish. So again, confirming her legitimacy not just because of her independent status as a sultan, but also as the full royal bloodline confirmed upon her by being the daughter of not just Sultan Iltutmish, but also being the daughter of Turkan Khatun, who was the daughter of Qutbuddin Aibak, who established a sultanate in Delhi. So again, just like Hatshepsut, she drew legitimacy through her father as well as her mother, who was legitimized by her own father, who created this new dynasty. So once again, Razia's status as doubly royal superseded her stepbrother, who was only the son of a concubine, Shah Turkan. So again, we are seeing how it echoes through different periods in time. And her downfall came only because certain sections of the Turkish nobility could not, even though she was capable, take orders from a woman. And they used the excuse that she was wielding independent power and was chucking off her femininity as an excuse to dethrone her. And this is represented by the fact that Razia Sultan started coming out of the parda, and she never had the veil on, and she started wearing manly garb and started presenting herself like any other male sultan would. But the Turkish nobles could not stand it because they could not understand this new concept as of a woman in a position of power. But again, Razia was drawing from earlier cases like Hatshepsut's, where a woman uniquely positioned in this new status had to draw from the traditionally masculine array of presentations and paraphernalia to present herself to the people, because there had never been a female sultan before. So she had to present herself in a way that would have been considered masculine, but in reality, she was just conforming to the way in which every other sultan had operated. She did not want to limit her power simply because she did not have a cock. So she took away the veil because that was the only way to directly talk to her people and her courtiers without the obstruction of a veil. She started wearing manly garbs because she had to ride the royal elephants and horses and be able to go to campaigns and interact with her people and her nobles directly. And she referred to herself as a sultan because that was the only way to legitimize herself and not subvert her position as sultan by calling herself just the Lady Empress. But again, the Turkish nobles could not stomach that, and then they incited a rebellion against her, and she was ousted from her throne, and then she was murdered. And thus ended her rule after about 4 years in 1240 CE. But again, even then, they found an excuse to do that by highlighting her place as a woman, because in her court, she had become aware that her Turkish nobles were, overmighty and might not be agreeing to her rule. So she had started to advance non-Turkish nobility into higher positions of power. She had started recruiting non-Turkish elements into her administration and giving them more authority to shore up her own position. And one of these positions was taken by a Habshi or an Ethiopian or probably African slave general who the other nobles did not agree with. So they spread the rumor that she was having an affair with this particular Habshin noble. But when we look at the actual documentation of the period, it becomes entirely possible that this was just gossip mongering and fear mongering because the relationship was purely transactional based on the position of the sultan and her courtier, and there was nothing untoward going on. For one thing, that Habshi nobleman was considerably older than her because he had been elevated to a higher position during the reign of her father. And then she only elevated him to a more intimate position to shore up her position as the sultan and to have access to somebody who has access to larger forces and the horses and all that. But again, the references to her reign from later periods reference how this particular nobleman, this Habshi nobleman, would help her ride her horse by lifting her over her under her shoulder and placing her on her horse, which again contradicts historical information which says that Razia Sultan always rode the royal elephants and never rode horses out when she went out in the public. And even if the Habshi general did help her onto her horse, which is again extremely unlikely because that would be something done by lower level slaves and other officials and not a top level general of the army. That would have been in line with the privileges of an upper level general in the court of any imperial system. The closer you are to the crown, the more power you have, the more status you have. So again, we see that later historians trying to justify the ousting of Razia as Sultan by viewing her through a denigrating female position and ascribing on her weaknesses of the feminine sex that they think is not suitable for reigning on her own. But even then, they are not capable of saying that Razia Sultan was not a really good monarch and a really capable one at that. Even at her worst, detractors always highlighted the fact that she was very capable, she was very engaging, she was very active, and she had all the qualities of a great sultan, except for the fact of what she held between her legs wasn't suitable for the Turkish nobles. So again, in these two cases, while the outcomes were very different, in that Hatshepsut was able to shore up her position and rule for a really long time and helped Egypt through one of its most prosperous and popularly engaging periods of artistic and military successes. And Razia Sultan reigned over again an equally engaging and artistically flourishing and militarily strong position before it all declined during the reigns of her successors. Razia only managed to rule for 4 years, while Hatshepsut managed to rule for a really long time. But in the posterity, their positions were reversed because Razia got glowing reviews from later historians, even with the attacks on her femininity and her relationship with Yakut, the Habshi slave general, while Hatshepsut got her images and her cartouches erased much later in the reign of her successor because the Turkish generals and their successors was comfortable in discussing Razia's rule because they had erased her rule and kind of ended it prematurely. So they could say that this was an anomaly that they had corrected. But in the case of Hatshepsut, the Egyptians could not because her rule was successful. So they could not discuss it. So they erased her. They could not speak of this anomaly in this Egyptian kingship list. So they had to kind of erase her memory from history and ascribed all of her constructions, all of her great achievements to other later pharaohs who were only happy to take advantage of the situation and take credit for the great things that she had accomplished. Earlier historians believed that her successor, her step-nephew, stepson, Thutmose III, did all of this and erased her from history because he was angry at her. But again, a re-evaluation in modern times shows that the erasure only happened much later in his reign when he himself was trying to figure out his rule and his succession. And in order to make sure that his succession was successful, he had to erase this period at the discretion of the priesthood and the administration so that he could legitimize his own successor's rules and delegitimize the rule of a different faction of the family because his descent was weaker than Hatshepsut's. So, this is how, throughout history, different female monarchs in two different, very different parts of the world and different lineages and different political systems and religious systems had to adopt similar styles of gender nonconformity and adaptation of male and female presentations to adapt to the political situation and try to figure out a way to rule. And how they were remembered in their own time and in posterity gives us an understanding of the complexities of not just the political status of women in different societies, but also the history of the presentation of gender in different stages of history. India never again had an equally powerful female monarch, while Egypt certainly did. There is mention of Neferuat and Nefertiti, who possibly might have ruled a few generations later, just before Tutankhamun. And we, of course, have Cleopatra VII, who ruled at the end as the last pharaoh of Egypt. But again, the uncomfortability of historians and historiography and historicity to depict these women in positions of power is explicit, as the lens through which we see Neferuaten or Cleopatra VII is very warped. The same actions that other male pharaohs have done are viewed in different ways than when the females do it, and we ascribe sexuality and immorality to them. But again, that is how gender has always played out. So hopefully this episode about the relationship between Hatshepsut and Raziyya Sultan, who lived apart several thousand years but used similar tactics to shore up their rule, to shore up their legitimacy, to present their kingship and present their power and present their status to the audience in similar fashions, helps you understand at viewing history at different points of time and viewing legitimacy in different points of time and viewing the performances of gender for the authority of different people at different points of time is very apparent. If at least you get some interesting tidbits that you want to research further, I think my mission would be done here. So hopefully you have gotten enough nuggets to investigate further and read more about Hatshepsut of the 18th dynasty or Raziyya bint Iltutmish of 13th century India, and gain more understanding about not just their dynasties, but also the societies in which they operated. To read more about Raziyya Sultan, there are several books available. Peter Jackson's study of the Delhi Sultanate is an excellent book on it. To read more about Hatshepsut, I would always recommend the books by Deal with Egypt, particularly by Bob Breyer, who gives a fantastic lecture series about ancient Egypt. And these two academics are excellent resources for learning about these two extremely varied, extremely separated individuals who chose similar paths and had similar backgrounds, but had different experiences upon gaining the throne. So hopefully you will take that into consideration, and hopefully you have enjoyed this unique episode of Dravidian Does History. If you wanted to hear more about either Hatshepsut or Raziyya Sultan, let me know. If you want me to continue doing individual episodes like this, focusing on unique different periods of history or people in history or objects in history, do let me know. I'll take that into consideration for the next episode, whichever time it may be. So until next time, hope everybody has a wonderful day. This is Arjun for Dravidian Does History. Good night.